capitalists don't have anything other than capital. And Marx says something very interesting. He calls capital debt labor, right? And he says in this part, which I'm forgetting the exact words, but something like, he gives it, he says like a ghost. It doesn't matter who the capitalist is. That ghost takes over. There is a certain logic to capital which you cannot escape. Every capitalist has to work like that. The only alternative, if I have capital, right? If I don't work like a capitalist, the only thing that can happen under that, only thing of necessity, there is no other option, is the capital gets destroyed. That capital gets destroyed. So if that capital has to survive, if it comes on my shoulder, whatever my intentions, ideology, I will be a capitalist. Why am I going into economy, political economy to talk about historiography is, because here Marx says, in capitalist societies, for the first time, you have the possibility of revolution. And if you read Marx in his writings on history carefully, you will see he never, ever uses the word rebellion and revolution as synonyms. If I want to simplify it, and I think the simplification holds under most conditions, so you can almost use it as a rule of thumb. You rebel against oppression. Revolution happens against exploitation. And basically under capitalism what has happened in the movement of history, what Marx talks about, the movement of history to class struggle, right? You have reached a point where everything is black and white, or at least becoming black and white. So the scales can fall off. And there is a possibility of revolution. As an aside, why do Marxists put, all Marxist groups, parties, whatever their other fights and things would be, they would inevitably say it's the working class. In China in the 1920s and 30s, when the working class wasn't even in tens of thousands perhaps, Mao still talked of the working class alliance with the peasantry, under the leadership of the working class. In Russia, the working class was not even 5%. The workers' revolution, led by the workers with the peasantry in alliance. Because the peasantry can only rebel. They are oppressed. The exploitation is hidden under the oppression. Which is why Marxists in India of a previous generation, right? 5 minutes. Okay. No, I'll try and finish quickly. Of a previous generation, Marxists of a previous generation, and I'm not saying they were right, but I'm just trying to tell you why it happens, because we often hear of this and we sort of say that, oh, it was completely wrong. But they say that caste was the ideal, caste was the pre-capitalist way of class exploitation. It was oppression, right? So you can only rebel against it. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm not saying I'm saying this. I'm saying this was the Marxist understanding. What you can, so you can rebel against it, you can break it, you can fight against it, rail against it, but you cannot replace it. Revolution. You can completely dismantle it till you bring in class. So just like, even if you have 5% peasantry, you have 5% working class and 95% peasantry, you still have the revolution led by the working class. Similarly, which is why, I'm just trying to explain to you, I'm not saying that is right? Which is why Marxists, till very recently, have said that the class question in India, like anywhere else, is primary and caste and gender and all that is secondary. They're not saying it because, and I'm not saying that they're right, all I'm trying to do is explain to you. They're saying it because unless you do that, you will never be able to solve the other questions. This is where that understanding comes from. Right? So when you attack and critique that, you must get it right, what they're actually saying. They're not saying that caste or gender is minor. Now finally, since of the 5 minutes I've already taken 3, quickly come to India. I've given you some readings. Read those. But in India, I'll just make 3 quick points. The first thing is, unlike in Europe, where history, the discipline of history emerged in the 1790s, more or less, 1780s, 1790s, as clearly, I mean, you can link it to the Industrial Revolution and the whole intellectual changes that brought about. In India, the context was colonialism. The context wasn't industry and the new economy and the new society we were studying. The context was just the destruction of the whole society. Right? There was nothing new emerging at that time. The first Indian historians started writing, say for example, the first histories that were written by, say, something like Dadabhai Naoroji or R.C. Dutt, right? And other people, say in literature, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, right? They were basically reacting to colonialism, the destruction of what they knew, right? And linked intrinsically to that was nationalism. So history writing was about telling the British that we were great and your coming has destroyed us. The Marxists in India, when they emerged, Marxist historiography, could not, again now I could compress it, unfortunately I've taken too much of time earlier, but the Marxists could not entirely throw away this received baggage of the fight against colonialism and the importance of nationalism, which you will see in much that is being written. But what the Marxist historians did in India was crucial to our understanding today, which is to introduce class. Now, one of the things, readings I have given you is by D.D. Kosambi. He does an analysis of the Bhagavad Gita. I personally think that this is one of the, landmark writings in history anywhere, ever. You should read it and reread it and read it again. It's just amazingly brilliant. The insights that you get, because he is, see exactly what I was talking about earlier. He is saying that class struggle and the manner in which surplus is appropriated is the foundation through which you understand. But that is not sufficient. You need to do other things. And how we do that? And that all has to be grounded in materialism. Similarly for medieval India. Similarly for modern India. Right? So for example, that bit from Sumit Sarkar's Modern India, which a book you should all actually keep just for reference. I mean, it's an easily available book, you should keep it. Again, what Sumit Sarkar is doing is trying to cut into the anti-colonial national movement, which was very real and very important, to say that there were class issues there, there were caste issues there, there were various other things playing in between. And I think personally that given a variety of reasons which I can't get into right now, and just take too much of time and it's contentious, is that the BJP and the RSS is right. In the sense that a Marxist understanding of Indian history has actually permeated much more in Indian academia and thinking than the political force which is inspired by Marxism, in whatever sense you want to call it, right, has strengthened it. So what I'm saying is that Marxist ideas, right, that you look at society through the prism of class struggle, right? You try to look beyond the ideological constructs, whether it is religion or caste or whatever else, right? Region or something. You to look at the underlying material forces. Is something these ideas have spread more, much more in Indian academia and thinking, general thinking, opinion in India, than is warranted by the strength that Marxist politics, Marxist-inspired politics has, right? Which has always remained a minor force in India, right? Sometimes it's punched above its weight, but be that as it may, it has remained a minor force. But some of these Marxist ideas you'll find in various places. People who are avowedly non-Marxist, anti-Marxist, use those. And it is something, in a sense, if I can end on an optimist note, I think it is something which, once the cat is out of the bag, it's just out of the bag. You can't put an idea back in. Once it's there, once it's infected people's minds, you can keep sort of suppressing it, but it keeps coming back. So for example, the whole idea that you can explain, for example, in India, in Europe, for example, you have very strong traditions of liberal historiography. Very insightful, very strong traditions of liberal historiography. Right? You don't have that in India. You have very strong traditions of non-Marxist conservative historiography in America, in Europe. You don't have that in India. So if you look out of Marxist-inspired, a lot of them would be saying that we don't care much about Marx. So for example, this whole subaltern studies started as an argument within Marxism, Marxist historiography, but moved way beyond. Some of them remained, some of the people who were part of subaltern studies remained, at least self-confessedly, part of what they called Marxism and Marxist history, but many others moved far away, right? But some of these things, they could not completely shed. In India, for example, you don't have a tradition of liberal historiography. You don't have a tradition of conservative historiography. So once you leave Marxist-inspired historiography in India, all you have is RSS-inspired thing, ki mandir yahi tha. The temple was here. And why do you know the temple was here? Because our faith tells us. And that Taj Mahal was actually Tejo Mahal. There's a Shiva temple. You have basically history like that. So it is both, I think, just to conclude, both a success, but it's also a danger. Because when an idea becomes too diffuse and nobody really knows, like I started off, nobody really knows what is Marxist historiography. Right? So everything goes. So those ideas remain in deformed ways, and like we were talking in the first session, often when those ideas remain in deformed ways, they don't help us understand things. They don't do what the idea is supposed to do. Anyway, I think I've spoken way beyond my time, so I'll stop now.
Yeah, I can say that. It is not a question. Certainly, I'm not a student of history, so I don't know. But you said that in India, the lack of the kind of non-Marxist tradition, and a strong nationalist tradition. Maybe can be that in Europe, the presence of liberal and even conservative traditions, they can be about response to a certain specific conditions there. And here, instead of liberal or conservative, it can be nationalist versus the Marxist. I'm not sure, but there are some very well-known names like R.C. Dal and Neil Gainsbourg.
Can we take a group of questions?
Yeah, I think that's better.
scientific understanding of history. Isn't that you're trying to point out that history has evolved from some certain state that it's grown, it is evolving to certain states? This way, are we ending to the Darwinian understanding of history? If it is so, don't we end up to the neoclassical understanding of human nature, which is the rationality or anything that the fact that human nature determines the economy?
I mean, we can take all the questions. Because we are putting it down. So that's some.
I guess I was hoping you would elaborate a bit on the contribution of person. Because there are not too many polymers that one of us know were contributed in the same manner to the history so is there a tradition involved in many regional traditions for the same variety of history? There are some historians who claim to have claim to connect themselves with the lineage of those people. So what happens to the regional history?
Yeah.
I have two questions. First, is Marx's proposition of history is quite Eurocentric. When it comes to India, it sometimes fails to resolve the question that comes out of indigenous societies of India. So, how do you think about the writings of Karl Marx's own writings about 19th century India and his writings in Herodotus about the 1857 rebellion? So, this is the first question. And the second question is class formation and class consciousness come last in historical experience. And what was B.T. Thompson was talking his experience in History from Below project. So, what is the relevance of B.T. Thompson's thinking in Indian perspective?
I have a very basic questions. If you clarify more and please help me to understand. Like what are the prerequisites or preconditions to be a Marxist?
Marxist historian or Marxist?
Marxist. Because in his first part he described what are the and one is for Marxist, need to be a member of any communist party or not? Second, third one is like for Marxist, you must be an activist or must be an academician or both or either like so you can like comment with that initiative.
मैं ये जानना था जैसे आपने बताया उसमें मार्क्सिस्ट हिस्टोरियोग्राफी इंडिया सब्जेक्ट है क्या हिस्टोरियोग्राफी में केवल इतिहास लेखन ही है मार्क्सिस्ट पद्धति से मार्क्सवादी तरीके से हम इतिहास को लिखना ही क्या हिस्टोरियोग्राफी है कि उसमें जो पूरा एक सोशल जो प्रोग्रेस है मानव जाति का इतिहास मानव सभ्यता इतिहास और विकास वो भी है उसमें हम ये जरा जानना चाहते हैं और जो मानव जाति का विकास क्रम है वो कैसे हुआ है वो आया नहीं इसमें क्या उसका अलग सब्जेक्ट है उसका अलग से कि जो मानव सभ्यता और मानव समाज जो बढ़ा है आगे वो किन कारणों से आगे बढ़ा है कैसे वो डेवलप हुआ है
you kept it open-ended on the issue on the subject of externalities and bringing changes. So sometimes Marxist historical tradition is seen synonymous with a kind of teleological approach to it. So how do we see events occurring and external forces? How do you place them? Whether kind of analysis of a rebellion or a war, how do you analyze it? Do you see it as external forces acting, or as you see it in the process of historical materialism, or how materialism is advancing, or within the who's done it.
Right.
Sir, how will you differentiate between Marxism as a practice and religion as a practice? And if you can, then how?
So the question is, can you say something about the method of Marxist method of inquiry in regard to the history of mind?
Do more.
Just a minute, let me just
Oh
write
no,
down
no.
these.
So you do this after that 3 more. Right?
No, I can take those, but just let me note them because otherwise.
You know. That's good.
So, because you made the distinction between the study, Marxism in academia and Marxism in, let's say, practice, to put it that way, there is this, according to my understanding, history has become more like history of nation making. So, for example, France would speak less about Alsace-Lorraine and more about Paris, and India would speak more about Delhi than about, let's say, the Northeast. So, in that context, is it possible that Marxist historiography is not able to harmonize between the idea of nation making and history as we see it, or as we learn, or as we get to access it, be it through scholars or be it through textbooks in school or wherever? So I wanted to know that, if harmonization is possible at all.
So you said that subaltern studies came from Marxism, but they sort of delineated. But some scholars I know where I have studied, but Shekhar Bandyopadhyay in his book on modern India, where he talks about this whole thing about historiography, and he also mentions about Marxism. So there, I somehow vaguely remember he has equated Marxism to subalternism. So could you just elaborate on that?
Just stop calling me sir.
No, I announced it yesterday. I think it's so ingrained.
Anybody?
So.
No, okay, you do.
No, the earlier one said sir.
Yes, so you talked about where Marx has he was postulated that there is a sort of natural equilibrium of the primitive societies that cannot be broken except from the outside. Can you elaborate on that?
Come on, what is food here? I mean, you are talking. Give up Marxism for some rotis and chawal, What sort of ideological role does food have on you? No. I'll try and just can I do these then? Okay, one by one. If I get the questions wrong, please tell me that I got it wrong. Lack of non-Marxist tradition, that there is a nationalist tradition, R.C. Nilkant Shastri. See, there is, definitely. In fact, as I said initially, because I had to, in the end, because bad time management, I had to really compress what I was trying to say in 15 minutes into 2-3 minutes. There is definitely that tradition. Jadunath Sarkar, various other people. But what I meant was that after Kosambi, Rumila Thapar, Irfan Habib, you have the whole bunch of people in modern India, whether it's Sunil Sarkar or Bipan Chandra earlier, forget about the name, but the fact is that post say the 60s, if you want a sort of watershed time, there is no history which is being written which is not influenced at some level or the other by Marxism. That is not to say this entirely Marxist history, and that itself is a contentious definition, right? So Nilkant Shastri, who is, tell me one historian, and I'm not saying this as a rhetorical challenge now, but do some research and come back after a year perhaps. One historian here in India, right, who is actually doing something which is not entire. See, for example, let me just give you an example from within history. There's something called the Anal School of history, right? It's hugely influential all over the world. Hugely influential all over the world. It is extremely insightful. Some Marxists have also been part of the Anal School movement and things like that. In India, other than Harbans Mukhia for a few years, there's not one person who's taken that on. it just did not manage to find even one person, right? Who is the person who is now researching, going into the archives, looking at archaeological sources and researching and saying, well, this was the Hindu period, this was the golden age of Hinduism? Nobody. Unless, of course, you consider L.K. Advani in archaeology. There is nobody. Really nobody. That is what I meant. Now, history for school children. See, the thing is, firstly, the three types of NCERT books, right? One which were written in the early mid-70s by Romila Thapar, Satish Chandra, R.S. Sharma, you know, all these people. Not Romila Thapar, R.S. Sharma. Or maybe even Romila Thapar.
Romila Thapar wrote R.S. Sharma 11.
For her. Then Vipin Chandra, then you had. So that was revised a few times. And then in, I think, 98, with the coming of, or 97, they had started revision. Whatever, sometime definitely under Murli Manohar Joshi with the previous BJP government, they revised it and a whole new set of books was brought in. And after they lost power in 2004, there is a third set of NCERT books which came out under the National Curriculum Framework. Right? I don't know which one you are referring to, but yes, I would agree that the previous version of NCERT books which were there were very good in certain ways, but they were very didactic. So they were, in a sense, telling the students, ye hai or ye nahi hai. Right? The latest version, for many other problems it might have, doesn't have that. It's extremely interactive. It makes you think. It makes you, in fact, they are still available. In fact, I would suggest all of you, in fact, one thing you should all do, whether you care for history or not, is to go to the NCERT site and download all the social science textbooks, especially history, sociology, and political science, because they are going to sooner or later get modified. Right? So before that, these are brilliant textbooks. These are brilliant textbooks, the ones which are available right now, and these are for keeps. These are really great textbooks. And you should see them. They are very interactive. The whole pedagogy, my daughter was in class 6 2 years back. In a social science textbook, you know how caste was introduced? There was a letter which was written by a person who had been given a job through the good offices of Ambedkar. Ambedkar wrote a letter to somebody who gave this person a job, and he was posted in a small town in Marathwada. And he writes to Ambedkar, feeling extremely guilty. Now, going back to ideology, right? Feeling extremely guilty, saying that I'm really unworthy and I have resigned the job, and you really went out of the way. Somebody like me, I'm nobody, and you gave me this job, you got me this job, but I had to resign it. Because, you know, in this office where I was, there were 2 pots of water. One is for the Brahmins, one is for everybody else, and there's nothing for me. I'm a Dalit. I'm not a Dalit, but there are, you know, depressed classes. From there, there's nothing for me. And sometimes, you know, when I leave home and I come back home, it's 12 hours and it gets really hot. So I cannot sustain. I'm falling ill. I might, you know, not be able to do it. Which is why I'm leaving this job and I'm really unworthy of you. This was the letter. And then there was this thing that discussed it. So this is the type of textbooks we have now. Like for class 6 students. Even in a classroom, we assume there's not a single Dalit student, which a lot of our classrooms are, especially in private schools. This is extremely subversive and really critical, really good, these textbooks. You definitely download them, not just history, but the others too. Okay, the Darwinian idea, who was it you mentioned? Here, you mentioned it, the Darwinian idea, evolution. See, that is true. That's a criticism of Marx which is made by a lot of people, including some Marxists, that there is a certain, and the word which was used later somewhere, what, teleology, right? Because Marx actually is a modern Aristotelian. He's deeply Aristotelian. So his whole thing, his whole intellectual project, as it were, political project, all through his life, was to find out ways how human beings can actualize their potential. Actualizing your potential is teleology. Right? Teleology is what? Teleology is the movement from what is your potential to your actualizing of that potential. Right? That was deeply ingrained in Marx. In fact, there is a criticism of Marx to say that this whole thing of end of history. Why does he say there's end of history? Because once you overcome capitalism, once you overcome exploitation, class struggle goes. So history, that doesn't mean, that's it. Everybody, there's a mass extinction. But what it means, end of history, is that motor of history goes. What we define as history, something else will come. We don't know. But what we know is under conditions of class struggle, which is history. What we define as history. This is very contextual, historical in a sense. The word history itself, the methods of history. Once class struggle goes, human beings continue, human societies continue. But what happens, how do we understand, how do we remember that past, how do we structure that past, what do we do with it, is something which we don't know, that we can only know, because again in Marx, following from Aristotle and Hegel, he says the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, which basically means you understand things only once you have lived through it. Once the process has happened at least once, right? So we don't know what will happen after that. So there is definitely, it is not, I don't think it is Darwinian. In any case, Darwin itself, what we consider as Darwinianism is a vulgarity on Darwin's ideas, just like a lot of Marxism is a vulgarity on what Marx's ideas were. But that is true. About Kosambi, see, he was the main guy who actually brought this break-in. There were people who had written earlier than him, like R.P. that wrote India Today and all that. But see, Kosambi, which is why I say that if all the writings that I've circulated, 4 of them, if you have to read one, read Kosambi, that thing, on the analysis of Bhagavad Gita. Right? Because what Kosambi does is, he will find a small ancient site in some village, which was being used over many years, maybe Buddhist, maybe some Shaivite traces and all that. And looking at the material available there, looking at archival sources, looking at other things, literature, he will construct this amazing history and ground it in social forces, ground intellectual history. Which is why I'm saying intellectual history is always considered as there's, class struggle in the other room, and now we are sitting here and doing intellectual history. But it's not so with Kosambi. So I think he remains, in a sense, the lodestar. And unfortunately, a lot of current Marxists actually don't follow Kosambi. I mean, one of the things which has happened among Marxists is Marxist historians read Capital, which is very important. One should read Capital. In fact, most people don't read Capital, which is very sad, because people think it's like a Rig Veda. It's only once you have gone through, your B.T. Randives, Vinod Mishra, or whoever else you want to read, then you read Lenin. Okay, then I'm slightly now fortified, then I will get to Marx, first I'll read EPM and some other things, and then I'll get to Capital. It's not like that. It's like a brilliant piece of writing. Even if you don't understand it, you should read it. The first thing you should read is Capital before you do anything else, I would say. So people don't read Capital. Secondly, people don't read Engels. The book which everyone should read, even if you don't read Capital, is The Origin of the Family, Private Property and State. It remains cutting edge theory even today. It remains cutting edge theory even today. And Kosambi is such a great historian because I think he's ready.
His successors, especially in regional history.
There are, but you see, the thing is, Kosambi's contribution is not regional history. Kosambi's contribution, like Marx, is the methods. And people like Romila Thapar, R.S. Sharma, Irfan Habib managed to do what they managed to do was precisely because they imbibed those methods. And Kosambi's methods, in that sense, are, he's 14 years ago when that the millennium was changing, there was this, all these lists, 20 people of the 20th century, everyone used to make lists. As I say, if you have a list like that of historians of the 20th century, the two people who would be there are Kosambi and Irfan Habib. It's like globally, they have completely changed the way you understand history for anybody, anywhere else. So I think it is very important. But to talk about Kosambi in greater depth means that I have to go and prepare more myself, because it's not very easy to talk offhand about it. But the fact remains that to the methods he shows of how to link local history, immediate things, material artifacts, through the entire chain of social history, intellectual history, economic history, is something which is unparalleled. About Marx being Eurocentric, yes, of course he was Eurocentric. Not just Eurocentric, he was patriarchal. How many of you know that he had an affair with his domestic help? Right? Yes. So that domestic help was part of his dowry. When he got married in the early part of the 19th century, the wife gave the dowry, right? So he was part of Jenny's dowry. She was part of Jenny's family, right? She came along, stayed with the Marxists throughout his life, and in that small, tiny flat in Soho, when Marx used to stay, he had decided that there were 2 rooms. They were poor, they could afford only 2 rooms. So the room outside with the window was where he would sit smoking his pipe and writing Capital. And the rest of the family would be inside the other room because he didn't want to be disturbed. And while he was writing Capital, he also impregnated Helen Duluth, the woman who used to work with them. And he was such a chicken, right, complete chicken, that he couldn't acknowledge paternity. So he wrote these panic letters to Engels, who was, if you read Engels' book, Origin of Family, Private Property and State, right, you would realize had a reputation, right? So Engels came and said, it's all my way. And the child, once it was born, a boy, was taken and given in adoption to a working class family which was part of the First International. Right? You must have seen a lot of t-shirts with Marx saying, doubt everything. Right? People wear that. What they don't put is that in that same diary which he wrote for his daughter, where you scrapbook, what is your favorite saying, what is your favorite film actor, and things like that. So his daughter made him write that. So what is his favorite adage? Doubt everything. Great, brilliant. Every t-shirt you can put it. 3 lines down that, he says, what is it that you like in women? So he writes vulnerability. So okay, he was Eurocentric. Big deal. We shouldn't be Indo-centric and say that, we take up ideas anywhere. It brings me to this whole question of national history. This whole thing of Marx being Eurocentric, of course there are certain things in which he remained Eurocentric. He was a prisoner of his times. Like we are a prisoner of our times, as much as we are. The fact remains that there are certain things, the methods that Marx brought out, the methods that Marx thought through, right, have remained valid even today. That is not to say that they will remain valid 50 or 100 years later, because those methods are grounded in society. Right? Now, if society changes, maybe those methods will become irrelevant, if not entirely, but partly. It's very possible. That's very much part of Marx's method. So, but what we need to do is constantly keep applying those methods and see what works, what doesn't work, what explains, what doesn't explain to us. One of the things which has happened in the last century particularly is that Marxism, while it has got domesticated, especially in history, has got domesticated in the academia, it's also been hegemonized by nationalism. Right? And it's not just in academics. So you have national histories. So all histories are now national histories in a sense. Right? Whereas Marxist history was not. Even when he was Eurocentric, he was not. Right? He was not at all given to, any national egoism of any sort. But now, it's become increasingly hegemonized by nationalism. It's a big topic. I cannot, other than just flag it for you here. But the fact remains that, just to go back to this. Yeah, the fact remains that today when we try and do Marxist history, one of the big infirmities that we have, which is why I personally think, if you ask me, this is my personal opinion, a lot of the insights that are possible using Marxist methods fail us, elude us, is because we have been hegemonized by nationalism. And if we can actually try and go beyond that and look at what Marx is saying in more universal terms, right? Trying to see what it is in it, I think it will really be useful for us. What is the precondition to be be a Marxist, member of the Communist Party, activist, academic. See, who was this to ask this? You should ask me. See, the thing about Marx's method is that thinking and action cannot ever be separated. They are one and the same. Because Marx says, unless you act, you cannot think. Right? So it is not that I had the idea of a pot, then I took a piece of clay and I made a pot. It's by dirtying my fingers in soil, I keep doing it, and suddenly something comes up, and I think, and it's interactive. You cannot say what comes first and what comes second, cause and effect, that thing, right? So I'm working and sensing, okay, so this can happen, and then I do more. And it is constant work and action, and thinking, simultaneously, which cannot be divided. So, given that, you cannot only be a thinker and only be an activist. Unfortunately, what has happened is, in our academic world, Marxism is only about thinking. In our communist parties, it's completely divided that you have these worker drones and then you have the thinking Politburo sitting in central communities. Right? So that differentiation has happened, which is partly true not partly true, this is entirely true for every communist party that you can think of. I can't think of any communist party today in the world which doesn't do that. And parties which manage to break that actually break the mold of the Communist Party. So you don't necessarily need, but that doesn't mean that people who are in the Communist Party are not Marxists. A lot of them are Marxists, right? And as much as one can be. Now, social progress. How have humans developed? What was that exact question? I haven't got it.
पहले तो यह जानना चाह रहे थे हिस्टोग्राफी के बारे में, क्या उसमें मार्क्सिस्ट तरीके से इतिहास को लिखना ही है इसमें, कि मानव जाति का, मानव सभ्यता का जो विकास क्रम है वो भी है इसमें? स्पष्ट हुआ?
नहीं,
He's asking whether social formations are included in this report.
No, I don't think that is it.
मार्क्सिस्ट हिस्टोग्राफी हम यह जानना चाह रहे हैं कि क्या यह जो इतिहास लेखन से केवल यह जुड़ा हुआ है, केवल इतिहास को लिखना ही इसमें है हिस्टोग्राफी में, यह और भी एस्पेक्ट्स को यह रखता है?
हाँ, सिर्फ लिखना नहीं, but yes, primarily writing. I'm switching to English.
Can I also? No, I think it's also just 2 minutes back when you said it's about thinking and action, and both the things go together. Historiography or Marxist historiography, I think, is also ideally should be. I don't know if Aniket agrees to it or not, but for me, is also a political project of emancipation. And therefore, it's not merely about writing history, but it's about writing history in a way that it points out how social relations have evolved over years and how should we understand history so as it helps us in our class struggle. Whether the historians have been able to do it or not is something.
No, but see, that is the thing, because when you take away Marxism from political practice and put it into the academy, right? Then that link with political struggle breaks. It can be revived, through various means, bridges you build and all that. But that link is weak. And you are right that it is not just about writing. It is about Marxist historiography. I mean, Marx's conception of history is a tool for trying to understand. And understanding the world itself is, if you understand the world, it is inconceivable that you will not want to change it. Right? So that interlinkage is very much so. But when we talk of Marxist historiography, what we are doing, it's an intellectual exercise. For the moment, trying to just look at the intellectual processes through which you try and understand history. And that thing, for example, this whole thing of, let us just look at Marx's own recreation of the idea of how, feudalism, slave society, say what he calls, let's just use his categories, right? Primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, right? How did these, he himself does. He is looking at societies through dispatches. He's living in England much of his time, Germany, other places, France. He's looking at dispatches from societies which are at the high point of colonialism at that time, entering the high point of colonialism. He's looking at dispatches about what societies he calls primitive communist. He is looking at peasant rebellions that are happening, even some of them within Europe, right? And he is then trying to theorize that. He's trying to look back at that to see what can be done, how can be done. There's this whole work by later Marxists, both political activists as well as academicians, who are looking at what, there's a whole book called The Late Marx and the Russian Road, about how Marx was even looking at the Russian commune, the Mir, to say that maybe we can, are there societies which can move from agricultural, feudal relations into some form of socialism without necessarily going through capitalism. So there were all these things happening. So Marxist historiography in that sense has to remain engaged. And if you notice, a lot of historians in India, for example, are among, because of the influence of Marxism in India in historiography, you'll see that within academia, not that everybody is, but the largest number of people who are activists also come from disciplines in and around history. A lot of activist historians who are doing things, who are doing various things, including, say, somebody like Irfan Habib, who till about 5 years ago was the president of the Rickshaw Workers Union of Aligarh. So, apart from doing his history, he was also a trade unionist. So, that thing has remained, and it needs to remain if you need to be a good. I don't know whether I'm. Okay, there was this question about Marxism and religion. What exactly?
As in the practice, it is also an ideological apparatus, and the secondly, and the Marxism is also ideological apparatus. Then how do you differentiate between the two?
So for Marx,
and there are three determinants of it. That you should be doing this.
For Marx, Marxism is an ideology, but Marxism is an ideology which helps you overcome ideology to try and move into science. Right? It provides the tools where you try and become self-conscious of ideology and then try and move to science. Right? But the way Marxism has come to us, it is something where I am actually now increasingly persuaded that the way Marxism has come to us, especially institutionalized in the parties and states which adhere to Marxism, it has, become nothing other than religion. So, for example, one of the things which, there's a question on Bernstein, for example, somebody had asked yesterday. Now, Bernstein was a person who himself formed the word called revisionist and revisionism and used it for himself. Because he said that what Marx wrote was 50 years ago, in the 1850s, and things have changed, and his book Revolutionary Socialism is basically, he writes that this has happened, Marx said this will happen, this has happened, Marx said this will happen, this has happened, Marx said this will happen. Now, I'm not going into whether he was right or wrong, I'm just telling you the method, right? He was saying, now these things have happened. Now, according to Marx's own thing, we are applying Marxian critical tools, right? To try and say that these things Marx was wrong, these things Marx was right. And so, given that these have been the results over the last 50 years of the development of capitalism, of the influence of the working class movement on capitalism and various other things, this is what is right in Marxism, this is what is wrong in Marxism, and this is what the political action comes to. I cannot for the life of me see how this is wrong. Every Marxist, by this definition, should be a revisionist. One of the points at which I was, like a lot of people perhaps here, a lot of people in my generation, I was an activist in the Communist Party. I was an activist, student activist. And one of the points at which the differences started becoming too difficult and eventually I left was because I started telling my comrades that tell me 3 mistakes, right? 3 mistakes that Marx made, or 3 mistakes that Lenin made. If you cannot tell me that in his whole lifetime, Lenin made not even 3 mistakes, then what you are telling me is that Lenin was God. And then it is bullshit. Right? Either Lenin made mistakes, and you have to tell me, you cannot say, हाँ उसने वो किया पर actually वहाँ conditions ऐसे थे. That is not a mistake. Right? Mistakes, where he was wrong. Marx, I would say, somebody asked me who's a Marxist. I would say for me, and this is like a thing I use, anybody who doesn't tell me within a fairly short time of hearing that person, reading that person, what he or she thinks are the errors in Marxism or in Marx's own ideas, is not a Marxist. He's a Bhakt. Tomorrow he can become a Modi Bhakt, like Swapan Das Gupta or Chandan Mitra. They were all great Marxists, right? So there is no difference in the intellectual structure. Why Marx? How are you criticizing Marx? Marx on that page has said this. He might be wrong. He might just have had a fight with his, the maidservant whom he later went and impregnated. He might be wrong. Of course he was wrong on 10 things. It is, by definition, if he was a human being, he was wrong on more than 3 things, I'm sure. But if you cannot, for the life of you, identify 3 things, at least, then you are not a Marxist. You are a Bhakt, a religious follower. And basically, my thing is, I don't waste my time on them anymore. I wasted the first 25, 30 years of my life. No more. I would rather read somebody who might be professionally right-wing but has some insights or engage with something else than engage with the Bhakt. So there is, the received Marxism is often like religion. And I will tell you, not just now in the next 9 days, good time because you are talking about Marx, but over the next year, work out what are the 3 things that Marx was wrong. And not justification, he made a mistake because, he didn't have enough information. That criticism is bullshit. That doesn't mean anything. Marx was wrong even with all the information in his hand. And that is the Marxist method, even in history. Right? So what finally is the Marxist method? The Marxist method, and this is where I'll end because I think more or less I have covered everything except for primitive societies and equilibrium and Marxism and subaltern's relation. Okay, let me just quickly see Marxism, subalterns emerged as an argument within Marxism. Right? Rereading of Marxist historiography in India through Gramsci and Foucault. By the way, both, even if you don't consider Foucault a Marxist, both till the end remain avowedly Marxist. Foucault in 1968 was a member of the Maoist party in France throwing Molotov cocktails during the, the 68 uprising. Right? He was thrown out of the Communist Party, given what Communist parties were, because he was gay, not because of any ideological differences. Right? As was Gramsci, avowedly a Marxist till the end. So the subalterns came out through an engagement with Foucault and Gramsci with the existing historiography in India. Right? Now, I am not going into that because it's a hugely complex thing and there's nothing, like, there are a lot of things, various people, subalterns straddle the whole spectrum. But the fact remains that over time, some of the central concerns of Marxism, right? What is the motor of history, right? What are the social classes which are moving, right? The materialist grounding of history. That finally, your understanding of history has to be founded on something which is materialist. Some of these were lost, if not by everybody, some of them. Right? So that relation remains, and primitive society is natural equilibrium. Yeah, okay. See, the thing is, my sense, and I might be completely wrong in this, my sense from reading Marx is that one of the main problems in Marxist theory, with which Marxists have struggled throughout, has been that these are closed systems. So what we had in the first session, for example, capitalism, is a closed system. The moment you put in petit bourgeois in it, right, it becomes complicated. Right? Similarly, this whole thing, the great transformation debate. Now, was it internal to Marxism that developed, internal to feudalism, right, that capitalism emerged? Or was it something external? In India, for example, right, Marx's whole conception was that the coming of colonialism had destroyed the material foundation of Oriental despotism, the village community, which is what started off the chain of history. Right? So it's right or wrong is a different thing. And most Indian Marxists actually have come up with brilliant critiques of Marx himself on his whole understanding of Indian history. But this thing remains implicit. For example, within capitalism, how do you explain colonialism? So you have Rosa Luxemburg, you have Lenin. Lenin's, if you think of Lenin, what is his central book? Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He had to write it because Marx was not able to explain the colonies. So that remains a problem. And I think my personal reading is that for Marx, there is no clear answer in Marx's writing, and I don't think he was himself very clear. How does that shift from primitive societies, primitive communism, to the first class societies happen? Is it just because some people start gathering more fruit? Or, what is it? And that remains a problem. And finally, on Marx's method, and I'll end there. See, the thing with modern society, the coming of industrial capitalism, the thing which demarcates this from previous societies intellectually is critique. CRITIQUE, right? And that is not criticism. Criticism is debunking. I think the word I was using, bullshit. That's criticism. Critique, in the way it is understood, means you analyze it, you break it into its component parts, right? You take what is useful and important and insightful in it, and you go beyond that, showing the shortcomings of what was there. And that is something which was there. No, it's not something which modern societies discovered, right? It was something which has been there with human societies for a very long time, or at least all class societies have had it. All philosophies finally some form of critique. But what modern society does is that critique that enters various, there is nothing which remains sacrosanct. Whether it's family, whether it's work, whether it's religion, everything is open for critique. And Marx's contribution is that he posits a method for critique, right, which does not take us into relativism. Those who leave Marxism, abandon Marxism, end up in some form or the other into relativism. ये भी है, वो भी है. And a lot of postmodernists, a lot of people, post-structuralists who have abandoned Marxism for some of the infirmities it had, problems it had, the identified problems, right? If you continue with critique, because critique is unrelenting, there's nothing. So finally you land up with Derrida's deconstruction. So you keep deconstructing and there is no end to it, right? Marx remains, for better or worse, for all its shortcomings, errors, infirmities, Eurocentrism, religious dhacha that everybody, all his bhakts have given him. Marx's method remains the only method of universal critique which does not lead us to relativism. At least that's my opinion. And I think that is why Marx remains so relevant for us today. And of course, that doesn't mean that what Marx wrote, his own use of his own method might be wrong. And it is open to scrutiny. He was a human being. And I'm really thankful, one thing I'm really thankful to Boris Yeltsin and all these people is that they brought down those horrendous statues of Marx and Lenin, which are only useful for pigeons to shit on. The moment you have these big statues, you stop thinking. Right? And we need to engage with Marx. We need to find out where he was wrong, not because to say that Marx is irrelevant. Because Marx remains the only person who can provide us critique which is universal, yet